Talk number 11, if you can believe that. This is the 11th time we've met together. So anyway, the Bible tells us from the first pages, no, this is not a shock to you that God created all things. And so we're talking about the doctrine of creation today. God called everything into existence with his word. He just spoke it and it came into being. Tripp says that you and I have to work hard to make anything. He writes, even when you buy a piece of furniture from IKEA with all the pieces properly designed in a booklet, that's questionable. In a booklet of instructions, you are driven to the edge of your sanity trying to follow the instructions and assemble something that represents what you thought you bought. And, when I did my kitchen last year, I assembled all the cabinets. I bought build it, put them together. Not a happy thing. It did get done, but the reality is, even after you've done something like that, at best, all you've really done is you've put some work into assembling something that already exists, which is a pretty good metaphor for everything that we do. C.S. Lewis, this is a great quote. I've never seen this before. He said, "This act, as it is for God," and the act he's talking about is creation. C.S. Lewis, the way it's worded here is a little, you have to really work at it. But this act, as it is for God, must always remain totally inconceivable to man. Do you get what he's saying there? So it's like creation never fits in our understanding. Like
Right.
we can't conceive of doing anything more really than assembling the parts that have already been given to us. When we say God created everything, what we're really saying is that God is God. Because you think about this, when you really stop and think about it, it kind of gives you pause, because even in Mormonism, but like you think of other false religions and so forth, their idea of a God is not even a textbook definition of what God would have to be. Even Greek philosophers could say that God is a being beyond whom nothing greater can be imagined. Like you can't, if you can imagine something greater, like the universe itself, then that person is never going to be God. It would be some kind of great being, but never God, because God must be greater than all things, meaning God had to create, he had to speak the world into existence, just as the Bible says. On page 200, Tripp says, the doctrine of creation teaches us that we do not look to ourselves for purpose, but rather we look to the Creator to understand the purpose of our life. The doctrine of creation establishes God's ownership. By the way, this is going to go through just like boom, 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 almost like bullet points, because he covers a lot of ground. It gets at the idea of ownership. If you look at Romans 11:36, and this is familiar to you, for from him, through him, and to him are all things, period. To him be glory forever. Amen. And that means, according to Tripp, that there is no thing in your whole life that you actually own, that everything you have is borrowed. Everything you have, you're a steward of. If you look at page 202, if you have it there, there's a long quote. I'm going to read this quote. It gets a little redundant, but I think the redundancy of it makes it a little bit forceful. And he's talking about this idea of ownership and how our sin really always comes down to an ownership issue. Like all sin is like a failure to really understand who owns the thing. If you think about a tool, how many of you guys were raised with a dad, by the way, that you actually had a dad? Some of you didn't. I'd be one of those putting my hand up. I didn't have my dad. But all men, sooner or later, even without dads, you learn that if you borrow a tool, you don't return it broken. Correct?
Or dirty.
Or even dirty, yes. You really should bring it. Like my dad, when I finally did kind of connect with my dad, he told me early on, like one of the few things I learned from him was you should return it better than you got it. Like you clean it up, you oil it a little bit, you bring it back, and it's working not just as well, but maybe even better. So it's an ownership thing. Here's what he says. Sexual abuse is an ownership problem. Emotional abuse of your spouse is an ownership problem. Racial hatred is an ownership problem. Corrupt politics is an ownership problem. Materialistic greed is an ownership problem. Eating yourself into ill health is an ownership problem. Who thinks of it that way, right? Adultery is an ownership problem. Thievery and violence are ownership problems. Selfish use of your resources is an ownership problem. Misogyny, whether subtle or overt, is an ownership problem. Failure to care for the disadvantaged and oppressed is an ownership problem. Anytime, this is a pretty drastic statement. Anytime you take your life into your own hands and do with it, even for a moment, only, and I think there's the emphasis, only what you want to do, you have an ownership problem. That would be something for your discussion time, because that's pretty radical to say that, isn't it? Because we're stewards and not creator, that also means that authority belongs to God. All authority, Romans chapter 13, it says that all authority is from God. When Jesus is about to be crucified and Pilate says, don't you know I've got the power? It's mine. I've got the authority to put you to death or to exonerate you. And Jesus says, well, you wouldn't have any authority if it hadn't been given to you from heaven. And with that idea, Tripp writes, whether you are a parent, spouse, teacher, boss, politician, manager, judge, pastor, or some other authoritative figure, you have been placed there by God to be a representative of his authority. The doctrine of creation helps us understand worship. And it's more than the doctrine, right? You have to have the doctrine put together with at least casual observation. It's like you take the doctrine of creation, which could kind of be kind of a dry, how logical sort of thought. Yes, for God to be God, then he had to. But then you take that outside and you go look at the stars and the heavens, the handiwork that God has made, and then all at once that comes in and it becomes an impulse to worship. It's also an impulse for humility. The doctrine of creation should kind of put our small lives into perspective. As long as we kind of think of the world as our oyster and it's all for us to just go out and claim and take hold of, and you're Bill Gates and you don't like the political things that happen with a beloved beer company, you don't just like spit into the wind. You go, well, I'll just go own the beer company, and you just buy it. Not very many people have that ability to fool themselves into thinking that they're that immense. There are a lot of implications. We're kind of moving into what would be the chapter 12 now, the implications. I find that he gives us implications usually in the first chapter, and then he tells us he's going to give us the implications of the second, so they kind of overlap here. But first thing it should do is the implications, we should live as though we own nothing. How many feel like that already just because you kind of own almost nothing? But a lot of times people that are, you go into a back alley where people are living in cardboard boxes and they have a very, very strong sense of what belongs to them. Even if it's worthless, like that's mine. But this doctrine should teach us that we're just stewards of everything that we have. He applies this to marriage, which I think is kind of a neat way to take a doctrine that seemingly is disconnected and draw it in. But marriage exists not only for our happiness, but to be a picture of God's glory and God's redeeming love. That's an ownership issue, isn't it? So we come into marriage and we think, oh, this is here for my happiness. 99.9% of marriages that start on that basis end in divorce. That I made that statistic up, but I think it's got to be true, doesn't it? If both people come into it thinking this is here for my happiness, that's the exclusive reason I come into this. If you're not making me happy, then all bets are off. Did you guys see Hugh Jackman is divorcing his wife now, or they are divorcing after 26 or 27 years of marriage? And I can't, it's not for me to judge the guy, but it's like, really, you managed to stay married for 26, 27 years. And
it was one of those, it sounded like one of those, you're not making me happy type.
So it did, didn't it? Yeah.
I don't remember exactly how it was worded in the article I was reading, but yeah.
She was like 15 years older than him, and I'm thinking, really, for 26, 27 years, she was able to make you deliriously happy, and now you're just now figuring out that she doesn't? I mean, or vice versa. It's like, okay, it's crazy, but that's an ownership issue, isn't it? Money's not our money. We're trusted with money, and so our question ought to be, what does God want me to do with it? What does God want me to do with his money? It ought to be how we think about it. Tripp talks about the doctrine of creation, reminding us of the fact that we are in a glory war. I don't know if you read the chapter ahead, but I like the term. He may have used it before, and I just don't remember it. But every waking moment of our life, in one sense, he says, we're engaged in a glory war. Now, some of the time we're fighting on God's side of it. We're like, okay, yes, this is about God. It's about his glory. It's about his glory. I want God's glory. I want God's glory. 5 seconds later, we're succumbing, and it becomes our glory, our self-interest that dominate. But if God is the creator of all things and everything belongs to him, then every ounce of glory ultimately belongs to him. Tripp states that recognizing God as the creator presses us with a question. We always ask the question, what is God's purpose for this thing? So if I, in some sense, own or experience something that God the creator brings into my life, then there always could be the question, should be the question. Not saying we'll always have the answer, by the way, but we should at least be asking, what is this for? Why do I have this? Why did this come into my life? You think about trials and tribulations that are in your life. You're like, well, this is a mistake and God needs to take care of it. Like, let's get back to how life is supposed to be before I had this trial, before I had this rotten boss. Like, that's not right. So clearly God just needs to answer my prayer and get rid of this situation and put me in something of a better, right? Instead of saying, if all authority is given of God and everything is ultimately from him, through him, and to him, and he in his sovereignty brings this into my life, then there must be a purpose for it. Even pain, and that's the one that Tripp kind of dials in on, but he says, yeah, there's a lot of what we call senseless suffering in the world, but is any suffering for a Christian truly senseless? Even if we can't dig under and fully understand it. Like, I mean, if somebody comes to you and says, when you're really suffering, well, there's a reason, you're probably going to, if you still, are capable of using your limbs, you're probably going to sock them one because of the insensitivity. But it's not wrong, is it? Like, pain, when it comes into our life, can do all kinds of, we know that God uses it to work maturity in our life. At the bare minimum, it's that. It can be for the glory of God that when a Christian goes through pain and they go through well, and they're clearly trusting in something bigger than themselves, the world around actually gets a glimpse of God's glory. So, yeah, we should always ask, why did God give me that? What's the purpose of this in my life? I don't think we should get caught up to where we are waiting and expecting to hear a very plain answer, but it's worth asking the question. God created us to take care of the world, so there's the whole stewardship thing. We're back to the dominion that we were given in the garden. But does dominion mean that we, pardon my French, but are we allowed to rape the planet because we've been given dominion over the planet? Well, no. That's clear. We're to love it. We're to steward it. We're to exercise authority and dominion, but we don't want to be destroying it in the process. Here's an interesting implication. He says the doctrine of creation reminds us of interdependence. And if you think about it, I'm not sure he drew this out, but when God made us, how did he make us? With regard to community, let's say. There are two things in the creation story that indicate that we are created not for individualism, but community. Created them male and female. Yeah. Male and female, he created them. And then there's another aspect of community as well in the creation, and that is...
Fill the earth and subdue it, so have children.
Well, that's true, yes. Sorry, I didn't even think of that one. So there's three. That it says, God said, let us make man in our image. So even from the creator side of things, there's already kind of this community. So we're not meant to be independent. That's an outgrowth or implication of creation. Paul says, in 2 Corinthians 5:15, he died that those who live might no longer live for themselves. So there's really not an option for the Christian to live in utter selfishness. Unless you get marooned, and you're on an island, okay. That's when you get to start a church and be the only attender of that church. It's when you're marooned alone on an island. The doctrine of creation requires us to accept and admit limits. This is one of my favorite topics and an aspect of, I don't normally think of it this way, but it is. It's an aspect of our creation in that God created everything with limits. He created the fish for the seas and the lakes and the streams and the river, but not for the land. He didn't give them that limitless place. He didn't put elephants up in the sky flying around. He didn't put sheep into lakes. We have that which is ordained to us. Even when you get into the prophets and it talks about how the nations have their limits and God placed them in specific ways, and the seas can only go this far and no further. All of that is an aspect of God putting limits on everything. Even our time. I know time can fly, so that's kind of weird, but but there's always 24 hours in a day. Until the world starts spinning faster, There's 24 hours in a day. There's just, and we all are. I think we all feel that, don't we? That time is just rushing by, and it's not limitless. And it means you can't say yes to every opportunity. It means you can't be omnipresent. It means you can't be omnicapable, which takes you back to the humility thing again. Finally, we were actually at the end here. The doctrine of creation leads us to the cross. And I like how he got at this using the Hebrew word shalom. Shalom means peace. You've heard that, right? It's a greeting. Shalom means peace to you, that kind of thing. But the Hebrew word shalom actually has a lot to do with something that is whole and integrated and working as it's meant to work. So when you buy a brand new car, I'm not even sure that's true when you buy a brand new. Have you ever bought a brand new car and there's always some little bug to it? But for the most part, you drive it off the lot, everything is working, every button, every system, everything is smooth, everything sounds like a new car, everything's tight, and the feel of it is just, and then it just goes downhill from there. But shalom would be the idea that God created the universe in a way, before our sin, he had a universe that just functioned rightly and smoothly, and everything integrated, and everything was in its right place. And the lack of that, the absence of that, is in the heart of every human being, in the experience of every human being. Like even atheists, they look at the world and they go, this world isn't the way it should be. And they complain about the God they don't believe in. They go, if there were a God, why would he create such a crummy, non-working universe? And our answer would be he created a perfectly working universe where there was this shalom. What you're feeling, dear atheist brother, is the break in that which we as human beings brought about. And so that should drive us to the cross. Ultimately, we would be wanting the restoration, the redemption, and all of those things. So, all right, that is a big flying overview of those two chapters. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys and have your little table group thing. I think we're a little oddly distributed. We should move one of you over here to this group to have either that or make one big group if you like, but I leave it to you. And you can ask different questions, like if any of those things that I said brought up a question in your mind you want to discuss, then you don't have to follow the thing.